James. This is our second episode of the year, third overall. I'm excited to do this again.
Yeah, I'm happy they funded season 2. You know, a lot of shows are starting to get canceled these days, and we made it through to the second season, with our immense funding.
That is true. I have a fun fact as we start this.
Oh, gosh.
We've had explosive growth on Spotify over the last 1 week.
We've had explosive growth?
We've had 100% increase in subscribers.
Oh, what number are we at now?
Well, it was 2 before, which I think was me and my wife, because I'm not sure if you followed us on Spotify.
I'll check after this, but yeah, no, it's very possible. I'm not subscribed.
So, double that number, and
wow.
Well, this is us crushing it.
Yeah, I mean, if we set a low enough bar, we'll always be crushing it. And as long as we're doing something for fun, I think we should keep the bar somewhere where we can knock it out of the park. And
that's true. All right, 1 hour of debugging, and finally we are ready to go. 2 things on 2 topics that are top of mind for us today. We'll kind of go back to our original format where, it's more like unpacked, deep dive analysis kind of thing, whereas last time we did the more predictions type episode. So this one, we have 2 topics that's top of mind. One is the whole issue with Apple Massimo and Apple Watch. If you haven't been following that, there was a bunch of controversy that happened closer to the end of the year where Apple basically had to stop selling new Apple Watches for a couple of their editions, and we'll kind of dive into it a little bit more. But a lot of interesting issues to kind of peel in as we go into that. And then the second one that we're going to talk about is the GPT Store. And if you haven't been following, OpenAI basically launched a new GPT Store that's kind of supposed to be like their app store. So we'll talk a little bit more about how much do we actually buy the hype versus not, like what's real, what's the actual opportunity, and we'll have some hot takes to go.
Let's get into it.
All right, James. So let's go into the first one. Apple versus Massimo. So let me tee this up, and then I would love to get your reaction, early thoughts on this. So timeline wise, sometime in October, there is essentially this federal body that's called the International Trade Commission. It's essentially the body that's responsible for investigating quote-unquote unfair trade practices. This also includes everything around like patent infringement, things like that. So if you actually have a patent and somebody is infringing upon, this is kind of the federal body that you would go to contest this. So the ITC in October ruled against Apple on a patent infringement case against this company called Massimo. The patent that they infringed upon is the blood oxygen sensor. It's essentially the feature in the Apple Watch that lets you measure the blood oxygen levels in your body. Massimo is a company that is US based. Initially I thought it was not, but it actually is. They're based out of California. They do a lot of consumer health electronics, health devices, that kind of stuff. So October, the ruling came that Apple did infringe on this. Somewhere in mid-December, Apple basically announced that they're going to stop selling 2 of the highest range Apple Watches that are available in the market. The Series 9, which the starting price is $400 in the US, and then the Ultra 2, which the starting price is $800 in the US. So
those are the most recent Apple Watches,
right?
So this affects the most recent models, is it?
And the ones that have the blood oxygen sensor measurement.
I guess my point is the blood oxygen sensor is the new to the Apple Watch. Hasn't been around before, or do we know that?
I think it's like a relatively newer feature. I think one of the things that I realized a little bit more from the research is off the spectrum of smart watches that are available in the market. There's a bunch of them that are focused on fitness. Like Fitbit is semi-fitness, semi-lifestyle. Garmin kind of goes pretty heavy on fitness and outdoor hardcore enthusiast kind of thing. And then Apple is one of the few that's actually kind of treated closer to a medical device in a lot of ways.
Oh, okay.
So the blood oxygen sensor kind of plays an important part in, that part of that positioning and how you think about it. And, yeah. So I do think Apple's trying to get closer to the medical capabilities. There's some interesting applications around AirPods, for example, could potentially be used as hearing aids, things like that. So I do think the blood oxygen sensors, kind of takes them closer to like a much higher bar as a smartphone.
I think I might be readjusting my opinions for later because up until now, I'm not in the Apple ecosystem. And so I didn't have that I just thought it was the default watch Apple users use. Yeah. And I guess I'd seen the stuff around the AirPods being more like hearing aids, but I didn't make that connection that Apple was trying to actually be more of a medical device.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess you're probably right that there is, a non-trivial amount of Apple Watch owners that just have it as a lifestyle thing, as an extension to the Apple ecosystem. It kind of plays nice with a lot of other Apple products. But I do think that the medical device part is something that's like relatively unique to them compared to a lot of other manufacturers. So basically, mid-December, Apple says they're going to pull a bunch of these off the shelves. And then eventually they did actually end up like bringing... So if you go to the Apple website, you can buy this product today. But they actually have a banner at the top of the website which says that the blood oxygen measurement functionality is like not available right now. So this is like a fairly non-trivial deal to Apple to actually ship something into the market and then have to revert that feature back.
I guess so. The nice thing they have is they can do that via software, and they don't have to retool a whole factory or things like that. So relatively a lower cost to change.
And there is some fuzziness around it. I think in the new watches that they are selling now, the blood oxygen capability is like not there, but in the old watches, I think it's still like there in some form or shape.
I think it might be tied with the actual law implication here, or the way that it's being banned, where it might be turned on when, since they're all manufactured outside the US, it might turn on the importation, like when does it come into the US?
I think that's right.
And that might be another point. I don't know if it came up in your digging. So this ban affects the US, but
that's right.
Presumably
that is right.
People abroad can have this oxygen sensor, right?
That's correct. So I think this feature is still available outside of the US, but in the US, the ITC's ruling basically applies only to the US market.
So now people can do like runs to Canada or Mexico to buy an Apple Watch.
That's true. Okay, so James, early reactions. Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, so I think maybe a lot of people out there probably have a similar reaction to me, where you hear about this and you're like, okay, blood oxygen sensor, A, like what is that? And then B, who's this Massimo company? And so that's like my first reactions when we were talking about this is well, I want to know more about this. And I think that a key thing that helped me visualize what the heck a blood oxygen sensor is if you've ever had like a family member or yourself in the hospital or something like that, the thing that they put on your finger that reads stuff about you, that includes, blood oxygen sensor. And
that makes sense. I also remember it was a big deal during COVID when it was like one of the things that you would measure if you were suffering from COVID, and if like your blood oxygen levels go down, that's kind of when, you're actually serious and need like medical intervention. Yeah,
exactly. Because if you are having trouble breathing, you measure that by how much oxygen you have.
Yeah, so that makes sense.
Yeah, and so I was digging into it, I was like, so what's so big deal about this company? Are they just... I was trying to distinguish, are they a random patent troll who just bought patents from another company and is like, attacking another company? But the fact that they actually have a product and they're like a leader in one of their product areas kind of shifted me away from that way of thinking, because that was an initial thought. That I think that's happened a lot in tech. So
do you have a sense for how much of their business is like commercial versus consumer electronics?
I do. Let me look at this. I wrote something down. I think what complicates it, and I'll get back to that number in a second, but what complicates it is in 2022 they bought a company that makes like high-end sound systems.
Interesting.
Well, I guess it was like a holding company. There's a couple different brands, but one you might know is Denon. Is it like they make audio video receivers. So if you have like a surround sound system.
Okay.
So that kind of complicates it again. I dug into one of their in December 2022 is the date of the slide deck. It was an investor day that they did, and they talked about their revenue guidance for 2023, and it broke down to 1.4 billion was going to be healthcare, and 0.9 billion was going to be non-healthcare.
Interesting.
Didn't go all the way down into like which portion was for which thing. I mean, so I would say it's like what consists of healthcare versus non-healthcare. Like, one of their products is a watch, and that kind of comes up in this dispute,
Yep.
does that count as healthcare or does that count as non-healthcare? Is kind of a question. I think clearly
That makes sense.
headphones are non-healthcare.
Maybe it's fair to say they're less of like a consumer brand in the way that like an Apple or a Samsung is versus, I did see a bunch of their products which were being used in like hospitals, and I'm guessing there's probably some like prescription devices that go to consumers, things like that.
Yeah,
Maybe
exactly.
less of like a direct to consumer play.
Yeah, no, I think I feel, I guess I'm skipping ahead in some of my thoughts. I feel like the effort here is that they would want to try to be more grow their revenue selling directly to consumers, and in part of that they can show, oh look, we've bought these sound systems, so consumers buy that.
Yeah,
but
that makes sense.
I think something that I might be reading too much into it, but a thing that happened after they bought this sound system company is they released a feature for some earbuds, which they talk about how it gives you like a personalized listening profile.
Interesting.
Because after a certain age, your body's deteriorating, right? So like your ears have a different response to what your headphones say and stuff like that.
Okay.
And so they apply this technology where they can test how your ear reacts to a sound and then adjust the profile as music comes through the earbuds.
Interesting.
To sound better for you. And my first reaction to seeing that is like, okay, so maybe this company is less about or maybe I would characterize the company more about being like a signal processing company, right? Because the pulse oximeter works by shooting different light into your skin and seeing how your blood reacts. And so that sounds very similar to, we did some things to your eardrum and now we see like we adapt the sound from that. So it sounds more like they're reapplying similar technology, which is cool.
That makes sense. And I think I did look at like the couple of patents that were being contested, and it did look like one of these, I remember seeing like a signals diagram in like one of their patent submissions. So yeah, I think that makes sense that, that's kind of their core business.
Yeah, and I think also if I was to go back to, we talked to their healthcare products themselves, like looking at them on their website, obviously very biased look if they're the ones presenting it, but they do show like graphs about how their version compares to competitors. There's a lot of, when you're shooting light into people's skin to measure how their blood reacts, there's like different complications to it, like people's different skin color or if they're moving can affect the reading, and they were showing how that they are more performant. So it does, I found it pretty convincing, even though I was reading biased information, pretty convincing that they are a market leader, at least in this original product, which is the product that the Apple Watch allegedly is infringing upon. And so I think that's a key point, is they are a market leader, they have a good product in the thing that Apple is allegedly copying.
That makes a lot of sense. So it does seem like they're a fairly legitimate company that has built a lot of these products. What is your sense on kind of where this conflict between Apple versus Massimo is? If you were on either side, like how do you kind of think about this problem?
I think I wanted to look at it from Massimo's perspective. I found it more interesting as because anyone that's going up against large technology companies today that play a big role in people's lives, I want to know where they're coming from. Yeah. And I think it's tough. I'll bring up a point that I don't know how much of a believer I am in. The company is still led by their founder, so you can. People like to talk about other companies having different behavior when they're founder led. So I think that might color a little bit about how crazy they might go with like, oh yeah, we can take Apple, or like we're going to totally shift from being a medical company to we're going to make a smartwatch and we're going to go all in.
And their CEO has been like pretty outspoken through this whole battle that they've had with Apple. Yeah,
exactly. And if on the reverse side, you could, I don't even know if I've heard Tim Cook talk about this, right? so like a little bit of they're punching up, so to speak. Yeah. But as far as like a strategy here, if they would want to stop the Apple Watch from being sold so that they could sell their own watch, doesn't seem like the one that they would be going for. At least I wouldn't want to go for, because I think something that a lot of streaming services are learning these days is user churn is really tough to fight. And that also exists for hardware devices, and a big thing that you'll have to fight, especially if you're comparing smartwatches into the Apple ecosystem, is can you really expect to convert a meaningful percent of users of Apple Watch to use your watch and not immediately go back to the Apple Watch the next year or something like that. Like there's a really strong, embrace from the Apple ecosystem that you'd have to fight against. And so, being charitable and imagining that they're smart, I think this is all a ploy to get Apple to pay to license their oximeter. I think largely they were showing in their results. I don't know if this was comparing directly the Apple Watch to their smartwatch, which and was showing the accuracy being better and following medical grade things in their own watch. So I think there's a clear you could show that that their sensor can be miniaturized into a watch format and could improve Apple's product, but I really don't think that they could expect to have a solid business going forward, convincing people to buy their watch. So I think their strategy should be get Apple to license their oximeter, and then get Samsung to license it, then get Google to license it, and that's probably the best hope.
That's a good point. I would imagine the other part of it is also, instead of maybe going direct to consumers, maybe their path is more, go to like hospitals that maybe use this for specific medical purposes. Maybe it's not a general purpose lifestyle kind of watch, but maybe used for like specific types of tracking, specific types of patients, things like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like when you're in the hospital, I think this could be super valuable technology to be like really adapt to how humans want to be. You don't want to be like all chained up to some machine that rolls behind you, right? So I definitely see the clear use case in the hospital. Yeah. And it's more, when the patient is at home, would they use their Apple Watch to measure it, or would they have a dedicated, Massimo watch? I don't know. Like, do you want to wear two watches? I think that's maybe where the thing comes up. And so, is there market actually folks that are recovering from illness, or those that have a chronic illness? Could be what they're looking for, but still, I think you're really limiting your market if you're going for that, and hence why it seems like healthcare is clear. Like that's where they want to use it. But as it enters consumer electronics space, how do they keep these bigger companies interested?
No, that makes a lot of sense. I was actually thinking about this from like Apple's angle, like if you were Apple 10 years back, how do you think about it? But maybe before we get into that, it's a little bit interesting to like understand how this whole patent ecosystem works. Again, like I'm not an expert on this topic, but I try to do a little bit of reading about it. So I think typically the way it works, at least in the US is apparently a first to invent system, which is basically it doesn't matter who files the patent first, it matters who invented the technology first, which is kind of nice. There is generally, I've heard, like a higher novelty threshold compared to other countries from like the initial reading, but maybe the part that is a little bit questionable is I'm guessing that there are probably slices of products where this threshold is harder and stuff like that.
Any idea, is it evaluated, how that is evaluated? Like I think one topic that probably was similar is copyright and fair use. Like it's a lot.
That's true.
That evaluation isn't necessarily objective. It's kind of like there's no, when you evaluate fair use, you can't like point at metrics, but can you do that for the novelty?
That's a good question. I am not exactly sure, but from some of the initial research, it sounded like it does go through a pretty long process. There's apparently like a decently long backlog of like patent processing and stuff like that. So it does look like it goes through a fairly longer and rigorous process. But like that said, the interesting thing is, so it's a 20-year patent by default.
Gotcha.
So generally when you patent something, it's you own the patent for 20 years. There's been some like interesting history with like tech company battles around like patent. Like I don't know if you've looked at some of the Samsung versus Apple battles before.
I don't. I was in my mind. I was having Google versus Oracle in the
the Java thing. Java stuff. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. So Samsung versus Apple. So there were apparently like a few different volleys of like code battles and all that stuff.
Oh, now I remember. Now I kind of remember. Yeah.
So this is like 2012, I think, to like 2016, 2017, something like that. So apparently, like the two kind of main issues that they like fought about, and they've basically been suits on both sides. So there have been like Apple suing Samsung and Samsung suing Apple. So the one where Apple was suing Samsung was apparently on some like smartphone design things. So, Apple was like one of the first ones to like design a smartphone. So there's just like basic constructs around, a smartphone is like a rectangle box with a square, with like a round button in the middle kind of thing. So there was apparently like a big battle over that. And then eventually I think Apple won, and then it was like overturned in court and things like that. So it's essentially kind of like, I don't think it like stood up for a very long time. And then the other one where Samsung sued Apple was apparently for some very specific wireless technology that a lot of like iPads and stuff were using. So at some point of time, the ITC, which is this International Trade Commission body, they did look at this wireless tech thing. They actually ruled in favor of Samsung, where they basically said that like, okay, Apple needs to pull a bunch of iPads and stuff like out from the market. And then it looks like the Obama administration actually vetoed this decision and said, given market conditions, competitiveness and things like that. So that's been like an interesting landscape thing. So it looks like the ITC is the body that usually determines, and I think there's like a couple more bodies, but like ITC plus maybe one more determines if there's a patent infringement. They make a ruling. They're not exactly like a court, but they can determine whether something is like infringed or not. And then usually, because it's an executive body, like the president essentially has like the authority to veto things based on some factors. So that's been like an interesting one here. So it does look like the ITC ruled in favor of Massimo. The Biden administration, I think, had like 60 days or something like that to veto, and they decided not to veto it. So this is like still holding up, and Apple's contesting it and stuff. But that was some interesting research on like how the patent landscape works.
Yeah, I remember seeing the coverage on this topic, talking about the previous time when Obama vetoed, or the Obama administration vetoed the ITC ruling. And the thing to highlight was that, well, at that point in time, I don't know how nationalistic it is behind it, but Samsung's a Korean company, Apple is an American company, but now we have two American companies duking it out. And I could see how, like, value-wise, you might want to be like, okay, we're going to, even if it's, tilting scales, like, well, we're going to favor our hometown team. And when you have two hometown teams, you just don't chime in. I could see how that goes.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Did you, I'm curious about the, in my head, turning over the novelty concept.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess, and don't know what I was thinking when I first heard you say that, but now I think I'm starting to understand again. Novelty, they mean, has to be something new, right? So that's why when you're talking about the smartphone design being like a square with a button, obviously like at some point novelty does change. Like, before the iPhone was invented, like a thing that was a rectangle and full screen that had a screen the whole expanse, you're like, wow, that is new. But as soon as you see the first one, it does seem like something basic. Like you can't, I mean, maybe I'm getting trapped here, but you can't patent, a cardboard box being brown is kind of my guess, but maybe you can. But like that's kind of example of like, you don't know what technology is novel until like a really groundbreaking thing gets invented.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think my most educated take on maybe what happened in that smartphone round button situation is more like, back at the time when it was actually patented, it was like a relatively novel concept. But 20 years is like a long time. Like technology moves a lot faster than that. So maybe the distinction that was made at the time of issuing the patent was, it didn't really like hold up with how like technology evolved.
Yeah, I think something that comes up in legal concept is whether like a suit or a case is ripe, meaning like not like fruits and vegetables, but meaning like, is it timely? You know, and so like if you're too late, it's too late. Like you should have brought this up earlier. But I think that does sound probably tough with patent stuff,
which is kind of interesting, right? So I think this is the reason why I was trying to think about this from like Apple's angle. Like if you were Apple 10 years back, like what is the calculus, right? Like you kind of find this company that has this interesting technology. I don't know if you heard about this controversial part, but basically Apple went and poached. So Apple basically started talking to this company. It was their head of mergers and acquisitions who was like, hey, like let's talk, see how we can make this work within the Apple ecosystem. A few months later, Apple goes and poaches either like the CTO or like one of the co-founders, something like that. They ended up poaching like a few more people from that team, after they poached like the initial exec from that team. So I think it's like an interesting play where, do you actually try to compete fairly? if you do actually poach somebody.
Well, let me interject here. I think we'll have contrasting viewpoints. I would really interject on when you said compete fairly, because I think part of my thing is if you have some talent that's so crucial to you, why would you let them leave? Or is if something's so easy, like one person leaving could totally disrupt your technology, like you got to compete better. I think I'm not sympathetic. It's not like you got a mom and pop donut shop and then Krispy Kreme moves in and drives them out. That you're warm and fuzzy about the mom and pop donut shop, but this is another company, sure, pales in comparison size wise to Apple, but billions in revenue.
I think the thing that I'll probably push back on is one is, if you're like a small versus large company. As a large company, you can obviously pay a lot more. It's easier for you to poach people, which is fair. It's like capitalism. You should be allowed to poach people. California does not enforce non-compete, so people should be able to go find economic opportunities that they care about. So I think all of that is fair. I do think that there have been specific situations where the people that have been poached, there's a very thin line between what kind of IP that you bring in and stuff like that. If you designed a particular system at company 1 and then you get poached into company 2, and how cleanly can you actually say, okay, the stuff that I thought about there and built there is not stuff that I'm reusing here, which I think actually happened in, I don't know if you followed the Uber Google lawsuit that went on for a really long time. So basically there was this person, Anthony something, he was apparently a high flyer engineer at Google, working on their self-driving stuff, founded this company called Otto, which is I think self-driving trucks or something like that, and then Uber ended up buying Otto. And then it turns out after a lot of litigation, they actually found out that this person had started this self-driving company when he was employed at Google. Apparently pulled a bunch of code from Google before he actually left, poached a bunch of engineers that worked on the Google self-driving team. And then eventually I think the case went on for many years. And I think there was finally a settlement. This guy was supposed to be in prison for 18 months, something like that. Trump, of course, pardoned him on I think January 2021 before he left office or something like that. But I think it opens up an interesting question of if you are a big company, if you are an arm's length away, do you kind of take the risk? Do you say, okay, we'll try to have as clean a line as possible, and then maybe contest the patent down the line? It's a tough question.
Yeah, and I think it's you'd normally expect if we would say that there's maybe some sort of blurry line here, what's okay, what's not, or that you'd normally expect a smaller company or maybe a startup to be more scrappy, and I guess that's kind of what comes out of your Google, Auto, Uber example. But a contrasting example of something similar, and maybe this ties to the novelty concept, and it's does the novelty, is it on the effect or how you do something? There's I guess a pop culture advice for listeners. There's a TV show called *Halt and Catch Fire*. I didn't ever actually finish it, and it's kind of set into I guess the 90s, and it's following some folks that are trying to reverse engineer an IBM computer.
Interesting.
And the way they were. There's a lot of drama involved, so I don't know how realistic this is to real life. Yeah. But something they had to do was that they had to get, of course, the super smart programmer to do the super hard programming thing, right? But they had two parts of the problem, figuring out how the processor works and something about the bootloader or maybe the operating system. Yeah. But they had to keep the people separate, had them to develop or reverse engineer both parts of the IBM computer separately, not collaborating. Okay. And the whole point was they had to develop it on their own without really corroborating with each other what they're figuring out about the IBM thing. Like
a Chinese wall kind of thing.
I don't know what you would call it, but the whole point was that they can end up with the same solution. Oh, it might have to do with processor compatibility, but you can end up with something that's compatible with and it might have been that IBM processor or something. I should really know my pop culture references before they bring them up. But the fact that it was compatible was okay. It's also okay that it was, because it wasn't doing it exactly the same. And so I know there's the other suit people might be familiar with, like Google and Oracle around Android using Java API, like the code that you can call into Java being very similar to Android. And that one ended up turning on different things. But the fact that you develop something independently, like how much does that play into the novelty versus the end effect of the car drives itself? It's like, well, how is the car driving itself?
That's right.
I'm curious about that when it comes to how the patent thing will shake out, because if their special sauce or patent is on the signal processing, the software component, that's something Apple can change without affecting their watches as easily. But I guess on that point, I'm curious what you think Apple should be doing here. Are they following things that you would expect? Like, how would you do it in their shoes?
I guess I'm not surprised in hindsight, maybe, where I think they probably took they took the chance for, like, this seems maybe a little bit gray area. Maybe there's a chance that this gets contested. If it does get contested, like, let's take to court. It maybe takes like 10 years to be resolved. Apple obviously has like more muscle to fight a court case out for like 10 years versus like smaller companies. So maybe the calculus was more, let's take the risk, the cost of not complying, maybe they can like bear the cost of that, right? So I guess it's like that's maybe what happened in hindsight. And then going forward, it's like they did mention they are making some software changes. I think the software changes right now are to basically block this feature out till they figure something out. But it does look like it does seem like a lot of the blood oxygen measurement stuff, like, maybe they're not doing this as good as like Massimo, but it seems like a mature enough problem space that they could figure like an alternate solution to it. So yeah, maybe it is generally like a good situation where the courts did held out IP rights, which I think is important, especially in a country like the US, where, I think the US has generally tried to be more forward when it comes to like protecting intellectual property versus like a lot of other countries. So I think it probably ended in like a pretty good place.
Yeah, I think it's going to probably have a reasonable conclusion. It doesn't seem too crazy. I think there's some other like big tech court cases recently that have had a lot of drama around them.
Yeah, that's true.
I think it would also have been interesting for you and I to analyze this if we had more of a background in pharmaceuticals, because I know something that happens a lot with drug treatments is they'll figure out a certain treatment and they'll know when the patent's going to expire, so they either have to find apparently it counts as a separate patent if it goes from like being a pill you swallow to like a shot, or I'm simplifying here, and outside my zone of expertise. But like I think there's other industries that also have a much more abuse the patent exclusivity thing
that's fair.
than tech does.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think when you said about us not knowing much healthcare, it reminded me of my. I spent like 3 years in like management consulting, and one of the fundamental principles there was always like, it's okay if you don't know anything.
That's great career advice, by the way. I think you just have to fake it till you make it. There's a lot of good career advice there.
That's true. All right, let's pivot into our next topic, which is OpenAI's GPT Store. I know we have. Of a handful of listeners we have, I think we have people on maybe different ends of the spectrum where they actually know a lot about like AI, but maybe there's also folks that don't know a lot about this. So maybe we can just tee up like some basic context around this. So I'm guessing everybody by now heard about ChatGPT. The maker of ChatGPT is OpenAI. ChatGPT is essentially powered by the underlying model. The machine learning model is called the GPT model. It's essentially a large language model. I think my dumbest explanation and understanding of large language model is essentially, you take all kinds of text in like the history of the world, put it into like a machine learning model, and it essentially kind of predicts what word follows another word in a particular context kind of thing. But that's obviously become like a really powerful tool. One of the things that OpenAI is essentially trying to build, and And I think there have been a lot of interesting applications that we've seen in the last few months after the ChatGPT launch, where people are trying to do like interesting things based on prompt engineering by basically like telling the GPT what to do in a very like conversational interface versus like having to write code and like having to develop an app and things like that. So the GPT Store essentially is OpenAI's attempt to accelerate this through like a formal store so that people could create their own quote unquote GPTs, put it up on the store, and users of ChatGPT can actually pick these up and actually use these very specific applications.
To clarify though, the store component might be a little bit of a misnomer, right? Because from my understanding, they're all free, right? But to have access to the GPT Store, you have to be paying for the plus or premium tier for ChatGPT. Right. Yep. So it's called a store, but for now, all the things in the store are free.
That's a good point. Yeah. So basically, I think you need to be a paid ChatGPT Plus customer to access this, but the tools themselves, the GPTs themselves, are free. Mm-hmm. You're right.
Yeah, and I think when I was trying to understand like what kind of GPT might someone develop, there's some helpful examples on their website that they're trying to promote this. So they chose some good examples. So one of them is, if anyone's familiar with the app AllTrails, they have think of it as like a database of hikes you can do around you, and people can rate them. They can submit a new hike, and so you can chat with their GPT, which will give you trail recommendation or hike recommendations, and you can kind of imagine. You can just ask it questions like, "Hey, I'm in this place. I need a 2-hour hike," and you can be like, "Oh, I need a hike that's easier or harder, or is it a loop?" These kind of questions, which I think feels really held back by a text chat interface.
That's fine.
But it's a good example of how you can more with human language interact. And I'll give one more because I think it's one that I've heard from others is actually a good example. So one was saying that you could search and get results from academic papers.
Interesting.
And I don't know if the example they're highlighting does this, but I can actually speak to my girlfriend works in the biotechnology space, and so someone we know that also works in that space talks about how he found it really useful to be able to upload a paper to something similar like ChatGPT and be able to ask it questions about a paper. So it's like consumes the PDF, and the experience that you end up getting is, imagine you read a long scientific paper and you have a question about it, you have to like dig in yourself, like do a find search for keywords, but instead when you train a GPT on it, you can say, it's like you're talking to the author, it's much more easy to say, could this be applied to the eyes instead of the liver, and either might get some stuff out of the paper. So I thought those were two random kind of different spots of different domains, but examples that you can see where a text interaction could work.
I think that's a great idea. I actually like both of those use cases where there's like an information synthesis problem. There's probably like a lot of information available, and you need to like make sense of it. So I do like that example. I guess the thing that I would question on that one, like let's take the research paper PDF as an example, right? Like why do you need a GPT? Why do you need a GPT plugin for it? Isn't that just like a ChatGPT feature where you like upload a PDF and it like gives you stuff?
So I think that's a good point, because if I built that technology, I think I would want the user to be on my site, using my thing, not be coming through ChatGPT. So that one might be maybe what I would take away from that is when it's too involved or too heavy duty, it probably makes less and less sense to be on the GPT Store. You'd want them coming to your website. I mean, I guess maybe someone listening 50 years from now will be like, wow, these idiots, they thought they would always be accessing the GPT through a website. So maybe there's some new, experience that we will not know. But as I imagine it through a website, the heavier duty your experience is, the more you'd benefit from going solo and come to my website to use my GPT versus do it via ChatGPT's website. Yeah,
that's a great point. I guess maybe the question that for you is, how much do you think this is a big deal? Like I've definitely seen like a bunch of articles and a bunch of opinions which are kind of like, hey, this is the next big Apple App Store kind of opportunity, right? And the App Store is like, I forget like the actual numbers, but it's somewhere in the tune of like tens of billions, like high tens of billions of dollars in like annual revenue. Like how much of a big deal do you think this is versus, let's say like the introduction of the Apple App Store?
I think to be able to answer that, I want to pause on answering that direct question and then go to how I got to my overall feeling.
Yep.
So the first thing I started with was thinking, I mean, everyone's talking about, oh, it's like the App Store, but for ChatGPT. So like there's that direct relationship. And without going too hoity-toity here, I was kind of trying to think about like, well, what are these actual things? And you may get some more examples for people out there. There's the iOS App Store, obviously. There's a software called Steam used for PC gaming a lot. And then I was trying to find one that was more different, but it seems to me that Adobe, the Creative Cloud, has like a marketplace for plugins and stuff.
Interesting. Okay.
And so like kind of generalize like these things have things in common, right? Like they're kind of distributing software for developers, and the users are coming to this one place. And so I think one thing in common with them is they take a cut of any install cost.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that's different right now.
Who takes a cut? GPT does or
the distributor. So iOS App Store.
Got it. Yep.
So in this case, it would be ChatGPT would take a cut of the price for any third-party developers GPT.
Right.
They kind of vary. Like the from 10% up to 30% of the price is going to Apple instead of random app developer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so something missing here is it doesn't talk about there's no install cost on the GPT Store as of yet. They do talk about in their docs about how in Q1 they will be developing a way where they will pay the folks that build these GPTs. So that is, I guess, around the corner, and that's as Apple's making tens of billions, but like of all third-party developers combined, or if it's they're making 30%, then I guess I can't do the math off the top of my head, but these third-party developers as a whole are making a lot of money as well. So you can see foundational technology could like really create a lot of economics.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess on the economics thing, the thing that I really liked your analogy of like the Creative Cloud or Adobe's plugin store. Like to me, this feels more like the analogy for this is like the plugin store, like Chrome plugin store. Right? There's a bunch of plugins in like Chrome. I don't know if you've like used like we've used Slack bots, right? Like Slack actually has a marketplace, and I don't know if you remember like the early days of Slack. So when Slack was essentially trying to build more of these like Slack bots and network connections into the Slack product, they actually used to pay companies. Like Slack had this incubator fund kind of thing where they would basically like fund people that are building bots to essentially put things into the marketplace. But if you think about like where Slack bots are today, I don't think anybody's making money making a Slack bot. Like the only Slack bots I think that are actually useful are extensions of existing product.
Yeah, it's like a feature of your product.
Exactly. Like if you have a Jira, if you have a Zendesk, if you had an Asana, like it makes sense to send some notifications into Slack, but it's essentially like an extension to an existing product rather than like a product itself. So I think I'm like a little bit skeptical of the comparison with Apple App Store, where I think this whole argument of this is like a whole new operating system, like that feels a little excessive.
Yeah, maybe we'll power through the skepticism because I think there's another thing that can make us skeptical. There's a difference between those. We're talking about the App Store and the money, and there's no install cost, and comparing to Slack and things like that. And a difference from all of those to this one is, and maybe I'm making some assumptions here how the exact integrations work, but it sounds like OpenAI, the people that are running the store, bear the cost of running the model, right? The user going across the pricing tiers of, let's just look at the first two of ChatGPT. There's a free tier, which is like you get less good technology, but unlimited, chatting away. So that's a kind of a risky bet by them. And then they have the premium tier, or the plus tier, what I can't remember what it was, where you're paying a monthly thing as a consumer, and you get access to their more expensive version that's better. But then you also get access to the store, and so it seems to me that the experience is probably you're chatting away and you add the GPT from the store, but the thing it's running on OpenAI servers. So I think that's a difference between the App Store is what is running on the App Store. It's nothing. It's the discovery, the download, but these are really like marginal costs.
So let's actually talk about like the. Sorry, I'm being like a product person, but let's actually talk about like what is the actual like user thing that can be done because of these. Did you end up trying the All Trails
I didn't. I'm
Okay,
not a
it
premium
was pretty
subscriber.
terrible. Okay, so the alt trails, so the ones that in their press release, they basically I think had like 6 or 7 different names of like GPT creators that they had shared. One of them was AllTrails. I use the AllTrails app. I use the AllTrails GPT bot. It's like not terrible, like if you're like, oh, like give me 5 hikes that are within an hour drive from San Francisco, under 5 miles, and has views, like, okay, it gives you like a list of 5 names, and maybe that's okay because maybe it's like a simpler search problem, so it's like okay to have that interface. And AllTrails also is like primarily a free product, so it probably makes sense for them to get more exposure through something like this. But the other one that I tried was Canva.
Okay.
Have you used Canva?
I have not used Canva.
Okay,
before.
it's basically like a design software. I think it's like I've used it for more like lightweight use cases, like the logo for the podcast, for example.
Oh.
I usually made it like using Canva. It's like fairly easy if you want to do like simple
Is this
stuff.
a sponsor spot?
Hey, if you want to sponsor us, I'm all ears. So with the Canva one, for example, Canva it's actually a very cool design tool, especially if you want to make like marketing materials. A lot of people use it for making like social media, like the images and stuff like that. And I tried like actually making let's make a LinkedIn post to say that the next podcast is coming, right? And I tried like giving it a couple of prompts. The thing that it gave me was like, hey, here are 5 templates. And then once you pick the template, it's like, okay, click on this. Now go to Canva and go design. Right? Which like, okay, to give them the benefit of the doubt, it's like, okay, V0 of the GPT bot, maybe it doesn't do as much stuff, like maybe it's still evolving. But I do think that there is a fundamental limit on like how much you can do within like a text-based interface. Even if you actually do improve your interfaces to be more like visual, like Bard, for example, has like some visual components today where if you probably tell them like, hey, give me like 5 workout exercises, they actually show you like images of the exercises. But I it's really hard for me to like imagine how this becomes a like a full-fledged interface that can essentially replace like a web interface or an app interface. And that's like one of my skepticism of like what is actually possible from within your
Yeah, and I think that the obvious one where it would be an improvement over the status quo is I think we talked about it in our predictions episode.
Yeah.
Was voice assistants. So
yeah, that makes sense.
if you're interacting with it as a voice assistant, I think that's obvious one. That's like, oh well, yeah, this chat interface is just we're faking. I'm actually talking to it. So that's one way I could see it going. But another thing that's kind of interesting is, and I think Microsoft nailed the branding here, is the idea of a co-pilot. And this is where I think OpenAI is not in a very good position, because the best way to apply this is I would love for it to be this way, but those of you that used Microsoft Office back in the 90s or 2000s, there you had the little clippy character that would pop up and be like, you need help with XYZ. Yeah. I think more of something like that experience, but like embedded into the operating system, so that that can help you do some sort of action. Because a lot of the times, like, we're humans, we want to do the easiest thing, right? But we want to like the easiest thing to get what we want. So sometimes it's like, do I really care about which restaurant I'm going to tonight? No, just give me the one that meets these criteria. Good. Or it means date night. Maybe you want to like validate them. So like you want to actually dig into the app that does that.
So maybe the bull case is like, let's say ChatGPT Enterprise is already plugged into a bunch of your enterprise software. Maybe it has access to all of the data that lives there. And maybe they find like a UI version that's like a Clippy, that's like a Microsoft Copilot kind of equivalent.
Yeah, I guess you're jogging my brain here. We actually have at work a extension to ChatGPT that allows it to incorporate knowledge from our wiki site.
Oh yeah.
So that's obviously a clear way. It's like I, as an employee, want to know how do I do XYZ at my company? If it has access to all our internal company things, it can actually be like my coach. But back to like the specific Clippy example, yeah, I'm kind of thinking of it sitting at a higher level. Like it's not like I go to open a web browser, go to this tab. It's like sitting there, it can see what I see. I mean, that's what a lot of benefit of the phrase it uses, multimodal, the fact that it can accept text versus audio versus images. Imagine it can just see what you're doing. You know, this is where people would probably want on-device processing. It can see what you're doing on your computer, and I don't know how it would decide to be activated, or you can activate it yourself. I think you kind of see early versions of this experience on search engines, or even I think I saw it more on Microsoft Edge, the browser, where you had their Bing AI that you could activate and it would come in as a sidebar to your existing web view. So I'm thinking that is
so let me poke it on this. I think I agree with the applications you're talking about. What is the GPT Store part of this? Like, you know, like I get why ChatGPT could, you know, connect to a bunch of these, connect to your wiki, connect to your all that stuff, like pull a bunch of information. Maybe it pulls, you know, stuff from Workday. Like that makes sense. It maybe makes sense for, you know, enterprise software makers, just like the way that they make like, you know, APIs to like pull data, just like the way that make like Slackbot extensions. Maybe it also makes sense to have like an OpenAI assistant extension. But like, what is the opportunity beyond that, like, you know, enterprise software API?
I would even say everything you just described is not the opportunity for ChatGPT, is how I'd view it. As
it could be for like their enterprise product.
Yeah, or I would say like the underlying technology under ChatGPT, the LLM that is their opportunity. But how a person would interact with it is not going to be through ChatGPT is my theory, and thus not using the GPT Store. So I'm very, very bearish on this GPT Store because of that. I could imagine, you know, if you're talking about the enterprise version, you know, you start there versus the consumer version. Enterprise version, you know, like we don't choose all the software we use at our company, right? So what's going to happen is you already, most companies with, you know, security have evolved to like a single login system, and part of that single login system is also managing how you can open any sort of application that the company wants you to get.
That makes sense.
So there's already existing parts of companies that work with connecting all these things together, right? Connecting the data together, things like that. So within the enterprise space, they're going to choose a vendor that does this, and it's not going to be ChatGPT, right? Unless they really like ChatGPT, and it's going to be kind of a more boring choice. But the employee is going to have something like ChatGPT, but they're not going to be, as an employee, going to the ChatGPT Store and add this and add this and this. No, their IT department is going to have set up the integration, and it's going to be embedded in. So
maybe the other version of that is also like, I'm not bullish that there will be a centralized interface from where everybody does everything. You know, like that's kind of what ChatGPT is kind of saying with the GPT Store, where they're like, okay, hey, here's your one text-based UI. You basically do everything from here, which even in like the enterprise case, like that seems like a stretch to me to say, like, you know, you can actually like, I get the search argument, like I get the information extraction argument where, you know, maybe it's like you want one search engine that pulls from a lot of different places and all of that stuff, but it seems excessive that there could be a central interface that actually gets like all of your things done.
Yeah, I feel like it's more likely to be augment what I'm trying to do, whether it's, you know, Microsoft or Google's examples of generate a slide deck, or it's like you're in your human resources UI and you're like, I just want to request some time off, and you can't remember the button, and you can just be like, help me request time off, you know? So I think it's going to, I agree with you on that one. And I think at least in enterprise space, it'll probably be something like that. But then on the consumer space, there probably is going to be a universal one. Well, there's going to be, has to be some sort of universal interface that's mediated by someone. And it's not, bearing the lead here, it's not going to be ChatGPT. It's going to be whoever owns your operating system. I think it's like, imagine on iPhone, the app developers can integrate with a specific, you know, LLM kit, and it can help them, like, you know, allow a user to use an LLM while using their context or respond to a general like assistant question. I think it's going to be, that's going to be interface defined, because no one's going to want to like learn how to use everyone's different LLM interface. And there's no way Apple or Google are going to let ChatGPT be the UI for doing LLM things on their on there.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess like let me ask a different question. Like, if what is the opportunity for more like independent quote unquote developers of GPT bots, like outside of the, or it doesn't even have to be independent, but outside of the utility use case where it's like your Salesforce and you have an API that connects to it. Is there a real opportunity for either like independent developers or companies that actually want to use the GPT source as like a monetizable interface?
I think that everyone will go back to when the iPhone first came out, like why would you make an app? You know, I can already do on the website. I mean, this doesn't really answer the question, but we all have a banking app now. We don't have to only do it on the website. So but those are all extensions of products. So it's really the questions about like, well, what's something that you sell that's right there in this experience that is native to that experience and non-extension of something else. And I think that's tough because I think what we saw in the iOS App Store experience is if the opportunity is large enough, Apple's going to make something and then it's going to be there. So I see that as difficult for as a third-party GPT creator. If it's a big enough one, the more, that's not super complex and you don't have any differentiation, it's probably in their interest of imagining ChatGPT as its own business to, take that from you. So your opportunity, you have to keep it small enough where it's not worth it for them, but it's like as an individual, a valuable space. And it's tough for me to think of something, and it's probably because I'm being a sucker, just like people at BlackBerry when iPhone was coming out.
That's right. I guess my bull case is probably like, okay, let's say I was thinking about this example of like legal documents, right? Like, let's say you wanted to write like a rental lease or something. It's still like a high precision use case where you probably don't want like an LLM to just randomly tell you things because there's actual contractual stuff that you're signing. So maybe, if there is like a lawyer or like a law firm that has a history of like 10,000 contracts that they've signed, like that's like data that they uniquely own. So they can essentially kind of have that like GPT app or whatever in the GPT store that's like trained on this unique data. And then maybe that becomes, like a monetizable enough asset where somebody's maybe willing to pay like a few dollars to do it, or they also like just get paid by OpenAI for it. Right? So essentially, like if you own a lot of data, and given the new scrutiny that is coming on OpenAI going forward with getting more data, maybe that's a good opportunity for anybody that has a lot of data to actually like build something like this.
I think that's true in a lot of, that's like the good application of this technology, and that you should do something like that. But where I'm skeptical is like, why would you do it through the GPT store?
That's fair.
If you have the chops to train over all these legal contracts, what's building a website? So I think that's why
I wonder if there's other use cases. Like if you were like a publisher, for example, that published like children's books. Like that's a use case that I've heard where, for teaching kind of experiences, maybe it makes sense if you had a specific corpus of like textbooks or specific types of things that you can like feed in that you own the IP for. I think your argument still stands that, why would you do it on a GPT store?
I think if you're using unique data that's like trained over, it seems like at that point you shouldn't be in the GPT store, but maybe there's some amount, if you're just retrieving data through an API, that might be a good use case where you're just using the interface as that human computer bridge of like, how do you help them solve their problem? Because that's lightweight enough where, because I guess I didn't even open up the UI to see what it would look like if I wanted to develop one. But my understanding is like you can make a simple one, so simple that it's just you giving it pre-prompts, because for those that aren't familiar, you have the default brain of this thing has been trained a little bit, but the way you get it to act in a way you want, you literally, as like a human talking to a human or like a 5-year-old, you tell it, you will not change personalities. You will definitely not do X, or you will focus on doing Y. Or if it misbehaves, you can get it back on topic by saying, no, you're not supposed to do that. Do this other thing. And so there's some amount of, this is called prompt engineering. There's some amount of this that's lightweight enough, but that you could do and provide a reasonable experience, and maybe someone would enjoy it.
That makes sense.
But I think I'm overall skeptical about this. But I think we've talked about the the things from like as a developer or for the consumer side, but I also want to talk about a little bit from the OpenAI side, or maybe ChatGPT. I think we should really separate it off as like that's a separate like business endeavor. So something that that I wrote down about was so how would they monetize it? Or they say they're going to pay out people that make GPTs. Imagine users like go crazy about this thing, start using all these premium GPTs, and they have to pay out these creators now. So they're bearing the cost to run it theoretically, and they have to the costs for running it scales, right? Because the more you query it, the more it costs them in compute costs. But then also their cost of, I guess, the revenue scales too. If they're doing a revenue share with these GPT developers, for every time someone's using it, they're like, is it like the Spotify model? Like the big problem with Spotify music is like you get more users, they're doing more listening, but you still have to pay the labels. So like your revenue growth is a little less interesting if you're like, it's keeping them shackled to earth. They can't like rocket off into space with success. And so like, I think on the can they control cost aspect, generally I think everyone expects cost to go down, go to zero, or go down enough. I talked a little earlier about like, it might be the OS, the operating system owner that might be the mediator for consumers. Well, guess where a free way to drive cost to zero is if you do on-device processing. So I think that's a difficult thing, that it'll take longer for OpenAI to get ChatGPT cost to zero than it will take theoretically iPhone to be able to run it on the user's battery for free, right? And then the revenue thing, it seems difficult to escape this Spotify problem. Spotify's version of escaping it.
But like, what's bad about it? Like for example, with the Spotify problem, I don't even know if it's like a problem, but like I understand what you're saying, where it's kind of like your costs are also increasing linearly with your revenue. I guess with Spotify, I do think it's a slightly different structural problem where they are dealing with labels. They're dealing with kind of more powerful companies or like artist management companies, whatever, who have a lot more clout over them versus if you think about something like an app store, like I think the person that controls the rails has a lot more power, and my guess is if you are a really large company, like if you're like a TripAdvisor, you probably don't want to like expose your entire search experience on like OpenAI. So the ones that will probably end up building more stuff is probably more like the mid-sized companies that are like okay with this additional stream of revenue. So I do think that like it is different from Spotify in that sense, where OpenAI probably has more control over how they monetize and how much they give out as payouts.
Yeah, I think I would agree on that, and that might show you like what kind of GPTs actually get developed.
That's a good point.
But I also think it puts a cap on the opportunity here. Both of us, hopefully it's not too overbearing, are not super into this as being a great great for OpenAI. It's not a given that it's going to be like the App Store, right? And I think a bit of that for me is this concept where if your costs and revenue are tied together as you grow, that's a little bit less interesting space to go in. I'm not a VC, but I imagine if you're a VC, you don't invest in ideas like that, right?
I don't know. I think the thing that I would probably push back on is like $20 a month is a lot. Like for a consumer product, like $20 a month, that's like $240 a year. Average revenue per user of like a paying customer, like that's a lot of money. And again, there is definitely that question of like, if people start clamping down on what data is being used for training and stuff like that, is ChatGPT, does that continue being unique enough in the long term to actually like charge $20 a month? Like probably not. But I do think that that's the fact that they're able to get people to like subscribe to a consumer search product is like a pretty big deal. And I do think that this is something that search engines did not succeed at, right? Like if you remember Neva, which was this subscription search engine, they actually tried building a subscription-based search engine, and they eventually shut down because, I don't think it was like a consumer behavior thing that was like a thing. But I think it's pretty incredible that they have been able to get the traction that they are getting.
True. I guess my question on that would, the traction they're getting, how much is that the free users and how much is that the paid users, right? Because the paid users are the ones that get access to this.
That's fair.
And so consumers love free stuff. So like that is what it's all about. Capping this opportunity is that. But you're right. If you get people starting to pay for your thing, that kind of also gives a feedback loop of if you're paying for something, you want to use it. So like it could kind of generate some good recurring like use from the users. I had a more wild idea. It was like a way they could escape this, and maybe it's going to end up being how they do it is like, I don't know if it's true, but it's popularized that the way Spotify works, it's like by minutes listened for your music for artists. And so I think that could be the way that they do it for ChatGPT. But another one I was thinking is kind of like microtransactions, like in video games. Like I guess a popular one would be probably like Fortnite. I don't know what they call their dollars in that, but like you could imagine that maybe they're another monetization scheme would, like, as a user, it's more complicated, but you're paying for X credits, right? And then like as your usage, the credits they're using, part of it like covering like your usage cost of running OpenAI servers, but then also the GPT developer is going to get X credits for every credit you spend or something like that. And so that's one way it could go. But I'm skeptical. Complex pricing schemes, not usually very successful.
Yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I guess maybe the takeaway is like, it is definitely going to change how like interfaces evolve in the future. I do think a lot's changing in terms of, users expecting more conversational interfaces. We've talked about like TikTok as an interface, as a search interface before, and I do think that like user behavior is changing a lot from the traditional Google search based approach to where it is. And I do think that the GPT Store will have a lot of cool applications that are built on top of it. I think both of us are probably skeptical that this is going to be like a great revenue business model for developers who are like building for this.
Agreed. Yeah. The underlying technology, bullish. Yeah. ChatGPT Store, bearish. That's
right. Also, like LLMs, bullish.
Yeah.
I don't know how much differentiation does like OpenAI. Maybe we should have a deeper conversation.
It could be a future topic, yeah.
Different time, but I do feel like there's a lot commoditizing. Like if the big providers of data start to clamp down, there is probably like a limited amount of long-term differentiation that like OpenAI has with GPT.
Yeah, and we talked about poaching earlier. At some point, the engineers that have worked on this for at least a year or two, they're starting to be spreading around the industry, and the magic sauce is going to be slowly out there. So it'll be interesting to see.
That's true. All right, James, that was a fun conversation. I think we had a good second podcast for the year. Excited to continue doing more of this. Thank you for listening to us. We decided we're going to do a plug because that's what most podcasts do. If you like listening to us, follow us on follow us on Spotify or Apple Music, or if you listen somewhere else, text me and James and we will get it uploaded there.
And I guess if you can't text us, Viggy probably posts this on Substack and you can comment it there probably, right?
That's true. Yep, that was it. All right, thank you for listening in, and we'll see you in a week.
Yeah, see you.